Hello, hello! I have a lot of Dragon Ball fans, so I probably don't even need to explain this, but there is a show called Dragon Ball Daima that recently released. I'm not going to spoil anything here, by the way, so don't be the, I'll watch it in 5 years, so I can't watch your video right now guy. It's fine, it's fine. Daima was originally called Dragon Ball Magic if you somehow heard about it way before and then just forgot. It was the last major project of Akira Toriyama before he passed away. So if you're looking for a general review about halfway through, because it's only 10 episodes in now, it's I like it and go check it out. But I wanted to talk about something more particular than that. Specifically not what Daima is about so much as what it's trying to achieve tonally. And in this video I'm going to contend that it is trying to bring the OG Dragon Ball vibes back into the series. The magic of Akira Toriyama. That might sound familiar. There's a lot of overlap between what Daima is doing and what GT didn't quite do. First, let's look at some basic similarities that make the two sound very similar, or make Daima feel like it's a redo in some ways. So in Daima, and again, I'm not going to spoil anything, just point out what the pitch of the series happens to be. In Daima, Goku and the rest of the cast as well are turned into kids. They have to enter the demon realm to follow the people that did it. There's a bit of a ticking clock element. They discover new Dragon Balls along the way, and they need to make a wish to undo what has happened. That is all trailer information, and since I'm not going to spoil anything, I'll just offer one generic criticism I've heard that aptly summarizes everything else, as a general issue that some people have with the series so far. The biggest threat so far in Daima is engine trouble. Now, me personally, I don't have a problem with that, but it is a good enough summary without actually spoiling anything at all. And I mention that only to make this distinction, that it's basically a roundabout way for people to say, where's the Cell? Where's the Frieza? Or it's a way to say that most of the episodes have been about traveling to a new place. I'll start going into this later, but it is a little bit more Dragon Ball, and it's a little bit less Dragon Ball Z. I'll also say that Daima has writing solutions for why don't they just fight these guys that do make sense, whereas they didn't in GT. Okay, now comparatively GT. I'll skim the first arc to illustrate a few points that I want to make. In GT, Goku gets turned into a kid. He is Baby. Baby is Baby.
Goku needs hammer to fix Baby back to his big size.
Anyway, we get introduced to the Black Star Dragon Balls along the way, which introduce a ticking clock element. If you don't gather them all, then you blow up, boom, whatever Anakin said. So they gotta find them Dragon Balls by going to distant, never-before-seen locations and so on. That's the pitch. Now as far as things that happen, they leave Earth and then crash land on some hyper-capitalistic alien planet, where they become criminals and have to fight some random guy who's stronger than Boo somehow. Then they go to a planet that has some giant bees on it, and a giant has a Dragon Ball stuck in its teeth. Then they go to Gelbo, and they have to deal with a monster that can allegedly make earthquakes. Oh no, not earthquakes. Very serious business. Trunks has to cross-dress and pretend to be his new wife. Or really, they don't have to. They're Dragon Ball characters. They could have just atomized the guy in a second. They chose this. They chose this as an experience to have in life. Trunks was made to do this. Anyways, it turns out the guy has no powers at all. So they get the Dragon Ball, but then the Power Brothers, who have the power to dance, steal their Dragon Ball. They chase these guys, they dance some, Pan gets turned into a doll and has stuff done to her. The Power's leader is beaten, but it turns out that his whip is another guy. That whip gets defeated, but it turns out their plan to power on Lude, big robot baby thing, worked, but they destroyed that thing. But it turns out that General Rildo, I'm saying that correctly, Rildo, not the other one, who is also way stronger than Boo, somehow, was behind it all, and now he's a thing. But it turns out Dr. Mew, a Tuffle scientist, was telling him what to do. But then it turns out later that Baby was actually plotting behind it all, so he's the real threat, not Dr. Mew. This is GT. It is meant to be silly and adventurous. It may not succeed, but that's what it's trying to do. Common criticisms are that most of the time it's boring. The rest of the time it's just things happening. Also that 90% of the villains should not pose a threat to them because, we saw the same series. They can atomize entire solar systems at this point. A lot of people find themselves screaming at the screen, just go Super Saiyan. I think Trunks goes Super Saiyan for the first time because he wants to move some rubble. But yeah, it's those criticisms, and as you can tell, the real threats seemingly just come out of nowhere and ignore power scaling and the lore of the whole franchise. And that's more the point. Viewers were looking for a continuation of the thing that they enjoyed, and they didn't get it. This is not a review or critique of GT, I'm just trying to illustrate the general tone and direction and reception of the first arc. And I'm only trying to do that because in terms of surface level information, Daima is very similar. Now, I'm going to contend that Daima is doing a better job of capturing that original Dragon Ball tone than GT did. It's a little easy to say that because Toriyama wrote the story of Daima and had almost nothing at all to do with GT. But GT has this feeling of a guy saying, like this, right? This is what those people are like. Look, I'll just say it. GT is Dragon Ball face. And it's not cool, man. Okay, I'm poking fun at GT here for the sake of the video. GT is fine. Maybe I'll do a more in-depth video about it one day. Point being, GT and Daima are aiming for similar goals. GT, in hindsight, did not succeed. And Daima, at least halfway through, seems to be somewhat succeeding. But why was this ever a concern? And this is the video that I want to make. Why does it matter if something feels more like Dragon Ball than Z? Yeah, who cares? If it happened now, and it happened in 1996, this has been a thing for at least 30 years. Now, anyone remotely familiar with the series could probably answer that question, but I'm a sassy little tart who likes to talk. So, spank my bottom and watch me go. Dragon Ball originated as this playful comedy adventure that was based loosely off Journey to the West. The series was rescued from being only about 2 arcs long by the World Martial Arts Tournament. It discovered a core audience with that arc, with the rise of modern shonen. The format of those early stories was usually one of Goku looking for a Dragon Ball, encountering a new place and its people, and often there's some quirky comedy angle to the place. Like Pilaf, for example, is capped off with Goku becoming a giant were-ape to escape a trio of villains who thought tickling Bulma was a fiendish form of torture, and also a pig wishes for women's panties and so on. Later on, Goku sticks a pole up an ninja's butt. I like that one is funny. Later on, they beat an Invisible Man by showing Roshi Bulma's chest so that he can get a nosebleed so bad it coats the arena in red, etc. It's Dragon Ball. It's exploding with things like this. But from the Tenshinhan arc onwards, the series gets slightly more serious and less preoccupied with new places and silly adventures and weird characters, and it gets more concerned with overwhelming threats and strong enemies. Now, in my old power level video, I mentioned this, but the first instance of this kind of number escalation was Goku getting beaten by Tao Pai Pai. Then he goes to train, and he gets a bigger number, and he returns and beats him, despite doing nothing any differently during the fight, in terms of, creative narration. He just has a bigger number, so he wins. Now that happened about halfway through Dragon Ball. Needless to say, that kept happening until the end of Z. And there was no line in the sand denoting this is when things are changing either. It was a slow, gradual process, and it blends together very evenly. This would go on for years and years. Arguably, Toriyama was completely exhausted of the series when it ended. I cover some of this in my Gohan's Mini Mass video, but due also to editorial changes, the series becomes more linear, less nuanced, less spiritual, you might say, halfway through the Cell Saga once he becomes Imperfect Cell. And a lot of things in the Buu Saga seem to be Toriyama trying to reinvent and recapture what he found interesting, from Gohan's Saiyaman antics to Buu being a silly force of nature, rather than a directed antagonistic force and so on. By the end of Z, the tone and the focus of the series was an absolute mess. So when it was time for GT to have the torch passed on to it, this is what it saw as being the next step. And since GT was so separated from Toriyama's involvement and Z had an ending already, they probably felt a need to reset things, get back to Dragon Ball, and hopefully work their way up in escalation like Toriyama had done. Z had already been escalated as much as possible. Goku beat the strongest in the universe, then someone made from the strongest in the universe, then some sort of ancient primordial entity that wasn't well explained. So when GT gets started, we get what the writing staff thought sounded Dragon Ball-y. But we also get what they knew had pushed Dragon Ball to the top of the market. In the West, we had a similar problem. We got exposed to Z first. Toonami was a lot of people's formative development. So when people think of Dragon Ball, they often think of Z, which means they think of a series of power level battles without much creativity or humor mixed in, at least compared to Dragon Ball. Obviously, there's a huge market for that. Dragon Ball's heart was always comedy, but its bones were always the screaming and the numbers, even across the ocean. If you want a good showcasing of how escalated this marketing problem has gotten, Daima is airing right now, but it's also coming off the heels of Dragon Ball Heroes. There, the uncreative, trashy love affair, with hair color, transformations, fusions, and so on, live on. Regardless of whether you can enjoy Heroes, and you can, it is still very trashy and has no real substance of any kind. There's no spirit of Dragon Ball in that show. Daima isn't doing that well in the West, but it's doing okay. Is it because people want screaming hair color battles? No, not necessarily. Arguably, it's because Toei didn't market it here, and all the streaming deals they made for it were only focused on platforming it for access, and not encouraging any of those platforms to market it themselves. Now, Totally Not Mark made an excellent video detailing this, but I agree a lot of this comes down to Toei not having faith that Daima would have the same Western appeal as Z or Super. After all, just look at Goku.
Look at his cute little monkey face.
GT had the same problem. How do you write it? How do you market it? Without getting into the history of GT's production issues, they didn't get any time to plan. And maybe more importantly, I don't think even given enough time, they would have been able to deliver. There was no hand-picked protege carrying on the spirit of the original writing style. It was just outsiders stereotyping and reducing what they saw down to tropes. And that is an incredibly common problem with writing when the original author isn't there to continue on the spirit. All GT's writers knew is what they saw happen before and what people respond to. They like tournaments, big numbers, and transformations. Fans always responded to establishing narrative escalation. Each threat wasn't unique, it was bigger, stronger, more dangerous. Fans loved the build-up of hopelessness, followed by the catharsis of some sort of breakthrough that lets Goku break his own limits. It reminds me of a runner's high. The moment your body's at its limit and it switches to that anaerobic respiration, burns fat for that precious ATP, and gives you that feeling of exceeding the limits of your own training, that sort of thing. It's a very primal feeling, and it makes sense why people respond to that sort of thing. But when it comes to writing the series, the details of what makes Dragon Ball feel like Dragon Ball are more granular. People don't analyze that as much, so it makes sense that when it's time to try writing in the same vein, people focus on the icing instead of the cake. It's like when I talk about my drawings, I say that I like to draw intimacy instead of just sexualizing things. It's like writing a saucy fanfic without any build-up or foreplay to establish the mood. Diving straight into the big event, I'm trying to use coded language here because of YouTube, just makes you come across like a child that doesn't understand the need for context or meaning to any of your actions. Dragon Ball as a series has an odd dichotomy of mindless, angry-faced number punching with, generic energy balls, versus what Toriyama really loved. Cute, wholesome, and comedic adventures starring memorably weird side characters who are promptly forgotten in Arc or 2 later. If the big fights are the pretty face and the shapely body, the adventure and comedy is the love that won them. The end of Z fell out of love. GT tried to recapture it and didn't know how. And you can't have a lasting relationship that's all physical. That problem has persisted in Dragon Ball's marketing for over 30 years. So why has this been a concern for over 30 years? That's why. That's what we're seeing again with Daima. It's the same battle Akira Toriyama fought his entire career. Comedically styled adventure versus the necessity of marketing itself as the father of shonen. It's the Jekyll and Hyde of Dragon Ball. They both live in the same body. You can't have one without the other. It's a cohabitation, a codependency, a marriage in need of revitalization. GT was not that spark that reignited that old chemistry, regardless of how much you like pink monkey fur. Arguably, all of Dragon Ball has struggled with that balance. The franchise is uniquely exaggerated in that regard, so you can see it in a far more hyperbolic way. Something like Heroes is just all Hyde with no Jekyll. Anyway, check out Daima. Maybe it'll rekindle some of that old flame. If nothing else, it's another take on the formula that will help you recontextualize what you love and why you love it. Trying different things helps you to shape your understanding of your own needs, after all. That's why my channel is such a mess of different subjects. It's also why I need a Patreon to keep myself alive. YouTube does not like random adventures. Be critical, be kind. See you guys next time.